welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off from our last discussion of the Sabbath. And if you didn't get a chance to watch that video, I'll put it in the link in the description below. So the question that we're going to be examining today is the Sabbath a ritual law or a moral law? And with that said, let's jump into the New Testament now. When defending his questionable Sabbath activities, Jesus always used Old Testament ritual laws as his defense. In other words, Jesus always compared the Sabbath to a ritual law and never a moral law. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, we're going to be looking at this passage, and I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with it already, so I'm not going to read it all off to you, but you're free to pause the video and read it if you'd like. But basically, Jesus and his disciples are going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry, and they picked the heads of grain and started eating. So the teachers of the law saw this, and they accused Jesus that his disciples broke the Sabbath by picking heads of grain. Okay, and like we said, I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with this story already, but I want to point some things out to you about this. Here we can see something very important. When Jesus is questioned about the breaking of the Sabbath, Jesus defends himself and his disciples by comparing the breaking of the Sabbath to the breaking of a temple ritual law by using the example of how David and his men were innocent for breaking a ritual law of eating the consecrated showbread, which was by ritual law only for the priests. And Jesus compared that to his disciples also breaking a ritual law of the Sabbath and yet were innocent. Jesus follows up his point that human life is more important than just a ritual law. So then, after this comparison of breaking the Sabbath and the eating of the showbread, Jesus then immediately follows up this comparison with another comparison of the breaking of the Sabbath when the priests worked in the temple on the Sabbath and yet were innocent, despite the fact that work was forbidden on the Sabbath. So here we can see two examples where Jesus defended the breaking of the Sabbath by comparing it to a temple ritual law. And as you've heard, we should have at least two texts to support Scripture. Here's a third one. Again, I'm not going to read all of this off to you, but basically in John chapter 7, the teachers of the law were condemning Jesus for breaking the Sabbath. And the teachers of the law are referring to John chapter 5. So to understand the context of the conversation in John chapter 7, we have to first understand what the teachers of the law are referring to in John chapter 5 about the Sabbath. In John chapter 5, when Jesus healed the paralytic man on the Sabbath by commanding the man after healing him to break the Sabbath by instructing him to carry his pallet or load, let's remember they were not allowed to carry a load on the Sabbath as this would constitute as work, and this was without a doubt a heavy load which the man had to carry. We can be sure of that since the paralytic man had been lying on that mat for close to 40 years. Anyways, Jesus once again compares the law of the Sabbath here to a ritual law of circumcision. So to understand this, we have to understand that the Jews did recognize that some ceremonial laws were more important than others. One example of this was that they were commanded to circumcise on the 8th day, but they had a problem. If the 8th day fell on the Sabbath, they would still work by performing circumcision, thus violating the Sabbath. So the Jews considered circumcision more important than the Sabbath. Okay, so the point that Jesus is making here is that the Jews would regularly break the Sabbath by circumcising, which is an act of work, if the 8th day fell on the Sabbath. Again, Jesus' point is that the Jews regularly did break the Sabbath because they acknowledged that it was okay to break the ritual law of the Sabbath in order to keep the other ritual law of circumcising the 8th day. Notice how Jesus compared circumcision, which was a sign of being an Israelite, to the Sabbath, which was also a sign of being an Israelite. What Jesus is illustrating is that both are ritual laws. Jesus is saying that he also broke the Sabbath in order to do something much, much greater in making a man completely whole as compared to just one body part as they did when they broke the Sabbath by circumcising and yet were innocent. Again, how could someone tell if someone else was a Jew? How they dressed, their kosher diet, circumcision, and yes, the Sabbath. That's why Exodus 31:13 calls it a sign between God and the Israelites, with the sign of the covenant in the ancient Near East always being in the center of the covenant. The Sabbath stood for all the covenant. In the same way, the U.S. flag stands for all that the Constitution stands for. So if you disrespect the U.S. flag, You disrespect all that it stands for. In the same way, if the Israelites violated the Sabbath, it was violating the sign of all that the covenant stood for. Those signs, such as circumcision and the Sabbath, only pointed forward to Christ. They were only shadows pointing forward to him. Just as he is the true Passover lamb, the manna in the Ark of the Covenant, Jesus is the bread of life, and the Sabbath, as Hebrews 3 and 4 says, Jesus is our true Sabbath rest. But now, the sign of the new covenant that Jesus commanded us is love for one another. Keep in mind that there is not one New Testament command to keep the Sabbath, since it was only a sign of the Old Covenant. Okay, the last thing I want to leave you all with is a noteworthy fact. The word Sabbath appears a total of 60 times in the entire New Testament. Now, all biblical scholars and grammatical authors throughout the centuries have always agreed that of all the 60 times the word sabbatismo is used in the New Testament, it's referring to the fourth commandment Sabbath and not a festival Sabbath. Now, of the 60 times the word Sabbath appears in the New Testament, there is one instance in Colossians 2 where it says the Sabbath is abolished. And the SDA organization agrees with all biblical scholars throughout the centuries that of all the 60 times the word Sabbath is used in the New Testament, it's referring to the fourth commandment. However, here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike the biblical scholars throughout the centuries who have held that all 60 times the word sabbatismo appears in the New Testament, it's referring to the fourth commandment, Adventist doctrine holds that they affirm 59 of the 60 times the word Sabbath appearing in the New Testament is referring to the fourth commandment. But the one exception for the SDA doctrine is where the word Sabbath is used in Colossians 2, where it says the Sabbath is abolished. SDA doctrine holds that this is the one exception of the 60 times. And it's pretty clear why the Adventist organization can agree with all biblical scholars for the 59 of the 60 times when the word Sabbath is used, it's referring to the fourth commandment, but can't agree on just one of the 60, with the exception being Colossians chapter 2 when it says that the Sabbath is abolished, since that would destroy the SDA false theology regarding the Sabbath. That's all for now, folks. I hope you enjoyed the content. Please don't forget to like my videos and hit that subscribe button for more videos like this.